Well, thank you for coming here. Some of you will, of course, be familiar with the fact that I wasn't originally on the program, and I was added onto it later. And I think this is quite interesting because what it shows is that some of us who are working within, I guess, what you would call the propaganda war about what's happening in Bahrain are succeeding in getting our voices out there. And I call it a propaganda war also because I think one of the things that we do as academics is that we, of course, study a particular subject, but we have a certain passion for it. We're certainly not disinterested in it, and we do have a stake in trying to change opinion. We don't have distance to our subject. And I was going to, of course, start with this extensive theoretical idea about why we should all engage in critical intimacy, going back to Gertrude Spivak's critique of post-colonial reasoning, etc. But I'll just say that I have an interest. I have friends who are Bahraini. I've been in the field. And when you have friends who are either being killed or put in prison or are being tortured or whatever, then it's very difficult to say, I'm just a historian, I'm not going to say anything. In fact, it's dishonest to do so. It's not criminal. So I'll start with that. I'm going to say three things. One is something about why I think Bahrain has been neglected in the wider narrative of what's happened since last spring, and why there are many features of what's happening in Bahrain which are common to what has happened in other places. And then move on to say something about the historical roots of the developments that we've seen, because as has been mentioned before, none of these various uprisings, revolts, literally began at the beginning of last year, but rather there were triggers which caused it to become such an issue, but they're much sort of longer-standing historical reasons why this happened. And then move on to certain things relating to possibilities. Why should we care about Bahrain? What sort of game changes can we see happening? But before I start that, let me just make one point about Saudi Arabia, which was mentioned a bit earlier, not explicitly so. One of the areas of research which will emerge pretty soon, and it's been already written in places like foreign policy, is about the counter-revolutionary forces in the region. And there's absolutely no doubt that the Saudis are the head of the counter-revolutionary forces, either through the actual acts of the National Guard or through the funding of movements. I tend to be one of a small group, or perhaps quite a large group, of people who think that the Saudis are one of the primary sources for evil in the region. And I will put it that strongly, quite simply, because they are fundamentally not just interfering in issues which get people killed in the region, in the Gulf, but also are trying to fundamentally interfere in places like Egypt. And I can imagine lots of Egyptians are not terribly happy about that. And also to mention that, of course, the Arab Spring, or the revolts, or the coming to consciousness about popular sovereignty, which we've seen, has actually not passed Saudi by. Since last spring, since, for example, the Day of Rage, which was originally announced on March the 11th, 25 people have been killed in Saudi. Not many people know that. Who knows how many people are in prison? We know of some very famous warrants which are out for arrest of individuals. We know about parts of Saudi which are basically on lockdown or have been intermittently on lockdown since last spring. But again, not very much of this comes out. And again, coming back to the propaganda war, what I find quite interesting now is that you're actually finding opinion pieces in newspapers like the Washington Post, which have actually come out very recently and strongly condemned Saudi hypocrisy on issues around the Arab Spring. And for me, that's a very interesting and useful development to see basically how the perception of the Saudi role is taking place within the region. Why, on the whole, has Saudi been neglected? Bahrain being neglected? I think there are a few reasons for this. One is the assumption that Bahrain is a Gulf country, it must be very rich, people have a wonderful lifestyle, it's so great. Per capita income is about $40,000. But then of course, this is an average. How many people know what percentage of the youth unemployed in Bahrain, for example? Percentage of youth unemployment is probably close to 40% in Bahrain. The average across the board of unemployment is roughly 15%, and that's a very conservative estimate. You go to parts of Bahrain, particularly the poor Bahraini villages, and I'll come back to this Bahraini thing in a second. And frankly, services are very poor. Parts of, say, Sanabis or Daraz basically don't have electricity in it. You have overcrowding houses, you have housing shortages, and this is often with a population which on the whole are quite well educated. And that's been the case for a while, that Bahrain has, certainly with respect to the region, a very well educated population which has aspirations and expectations. So the old rentier state arguments about how, well, this is a rich country, everyone gets handouts from the state, why should they really have political demands when life is so good, it frankly doesn't work. And really Bahrain is not a serious oil country in the way that some of its neighbors are. There's hardly any oil left in particular. Another assumption of why I think it's been neglected is that the idea is that there is, as a Kuwaiti officer told me just a few days ago, an external agenda at play in Bahrain. That basically what's happening in Bahrain is not a popular uprising, it is a certain expression of Iranian intelligence or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard at work. It's Hezbollah al-Bahrain. Which is very odd because I have yet to come across anyone who can actually tell me who Hezbollah al-Bahrain are in Bahrain, because it's not actually traditionally used. Unlike Kuwait and Saudi, where the brand Hezbollah al-Hijaz or Kuwait is quite well known, it's not really well known at all in Bahrain. And it seems to be a figment of the regime's imagination. And linked to this is its notion that fundamentally the conflict in Bahrain is a sectarian conflict. It's not just about popular ideas, it's not just about what people want and aspirations they want, but rather it's basically the Shia being uppity again. They're paying the Shia crescent, look how it's spreading, they took over Iraq, they basically control Syria and Lebanon. And in one case I remember something back from last summer talking about the Shia running Libya. Gaddafi apparently was Shia, if you didn't know. So this kind of hysteria about the Shia plays into this discourse of illegitimizing the actual demands that people make on the street. And in effect, of course, if one is objectifying these individuals as Shia, then of course one's kind of saying they're not really Arab. So even technically they don't fit within the Arab Spring because they're not really Arab. So these sorts of attitudes are really nefarious. Now, what we do know is that on the ground, the protesters have actually tried very carefully not to make this a sectarian issue. One of the most important slogans from the early period was, the Shia and Sunnis are brothers, and we will not sell out the nation. And this has been quite systematic and continuous from the beginning. It's really the government who has had an interest in trying to make it sectarian, and unfortunately they've succeeded. They've succeeded in actually causing divides in parts of Bahrain where the divisions were not as acute, or they even weren't present at all. And this has something to do with something I'll mention a bit later, which is some of the elements of the failure of leadership amongst the opposition in Bahrain. So looking at some of the features of what's common, the first thing I want to mention is that the movement in Bahrain is also, broadly speaking, leaderless. It is also very much a youth movement, and it is one case of where Twitter and Facebook has actually been really important in terms of mobilization. The people who have actually emerged as leaders now are actually not the traditional leaders, and this again is very similar to various other places. They're not the traditional leaders of the political parties, like people like Sheikh Ali Salman, or other members of Wifaq, who frankly I don't think have very much credibility or purchase in the villages, on the street. It's actually the youth leaders, it's people like Muhammad al-Masqati, who is the head of the Bahrain Youth Society for Human Rights. It's people like Nabil Rajab, who runs the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. It's various other people who sometimes collectively come together on places like Twitter and Facebook as Ahrar whatever, like Ahrar Sanabis or Ahrar Diraz, i.e. the free people of that place. And that's interesting, the fact that they are not signaling individuals, but they're talking about collectivities. And this use of the term Ahrar is quite important because it goes back to something which was happening in the 80s and 90s as well. The second feature is, let's face it, there's no going back to the status quo ante. This is probably true of every single situation where we've had these uprisings, but frankly, going back to what the situation was before December 2010 is not an option. And any negotiations which are about moving back to that legislative work, that doesn't necessarily mean we have full-blown kind of parliamentary democracy, republicanism, or whatever in these places, but going back, it's not an option. And this, I think, is also a significant common factor. The third common factor is repression by the security forces, which has been quite significant. One quick statistic: since 14th of February, when the movement started, and the choice of 14th of February is quite important because it was the 10th anniversary of the National Charter back in 2001, which signaled a move towards political reform after the troubles of the 90s. The 90s, of course, was called the Intifada in 94 to 99, and now people even talk about the second Intifada. It's interesting how the case of Palestine is very much, again, part of this Arab imaginary about revolt. The statistic is, since the 14th of February, about 72 people have been killed in Bahrain. 72 out of roughly 600,000 citizens. I did a calculation the other day, and this is proportionally as if 3,500 people have been killed in Syria. Now, if you put it in those terms, it sounds very different. Because one of the other reasons, arguably, why the Gulf has been neglected is because, well, no one's really been killed there. Very few people have been killed. And that's one of the issues. Related to the repression has been the emergence of the Baltajia, which we've seen in various other places, which allows the government to say, it really wasn't us, honest. It was not us, it was these other guys, and who knows who they're working for. As far as the Baltajia are concerned in Bahrain, it doesn't work because in so many cases these chaps are basically plainclothes security forces anyway. And it's been extensively documented. The other point I want to make, which is also common to Bahrain, is that one of the underlying issues is economic. It's about corruption, it's about crony capitalism, it's about unemployment, as I mentioned before, which is a fundamental underlying issue of discontent. There are various others I haven't got time to go into. Let me just say something about historical roots before I move to wrapping up. One of the fundamental historical roots of the problem in Bahrain relates to national narrative. The official national narrative which the Al Khalifa promote is not an inclusive national narrative. If you go, for example, to the Bahrain National Museum, you will be slightly amazed by the fact that it doesn't seem to reflect anything you've actually come across on the island. It's an exclusive national narrative in which it's only certain Sunni tribes who allied with the Al Khalifa who are written into it. It's elements of old the culture, say, of parts of Muharraq, which is of course a mixed area but predominantly Sunni area. which is represented. There's absolutely nothing about the majority. There's nothing about the fact that there are people from different parts of the Gulf or the other shore, Iranian origin people. The fact that Bahrain traditionally has actually been quite cosmopolitan. There are a lot of very interesting Indian influences in Bahrain, in language, in food, in certain customs, and the fact is that a lot of Bahrainis, to my eyes, are quite Indian as well. And that's because it was very much part of the Indian Ocean region, and that's not taken into consideration. The second historical route I want to talk about is the fact that there have been serious political claims being made in Bahrain for a very long time. There are petitions which go back to the late 30s about the formation of consultative assemblies, about the formation of trade unions. There have been trade union uprisings, labor uprisings in 1965, in 1972, again in 86, again in 93 and 94. And a lot of these movements had very clear claims for democratic accountability. And we often forget the fact that the Gulf in the 60s, and this is true of Kuwait, this is true of Oman, this is true of Dubai, this is true of Bahrain, had very strong leftist movements. And yet, this is entirely missed out of our narrative of what's happening there. And then there are a couple of other roots of the problem which I want to briefly mention. One is, of course, the Saudi factor. At least since 1979 and the Iranian Revolution, and the attempt at exporting revolution, which partly was related to revolts and uprisings in Eastern Province in 1979, was related to an attempted coup in Bahrain in 1981, the formation of Hezbollah Kuwait, bombings in Kuwait in 1983. There's been a fear that the sort of liminal communities, particularly communities where there are people who are Shia or who have traditional transnational links with Iran, potentially are a security threat. And this fear has very much been led and to a large extent been manipulated by the Saudis. One of the fundamental problems, to be perfectly honest, in Bahrain is even if the ruling family suddenly all became enlightened Democrats and wanted a serious transition towards constitutional monarchy, or even worse, if they thought they were going to vote themselves out of power and become a republic, it's highly unlikely the Saudis would let them do it. Because the Saudis would be concerned about the domino effect. They would be concerned about what impact that will have in Kuwait, what impact that will have in the Eastern Province, what impact that will have across the board of an actual functioning democracy on its doorstep. Iraq has been bad enough. I mean, Iraq is not a very well-functioning democracy, but at least in name it is a democracy, and that in itself is already a threat to the Saudis, which is fundamental. And that leads me precisely to what has changed with Iraq since 2003. The fact that Iraq has fundamentally changed, the fact that there are new arguments about the very nature of identity in Iraq, again raises and poses challenges to the status quo both in Bahrain and in Saudi. And one of the effects, and I've come across this by speaking to activists in particular, one thing they said again and again is that although we're not Iraqi and we have links, of course, to Iraq, transnational links which go back generations, what happened in Iraq was to allow something which was unthinkable to happen, and so the change has encouraged us. It's not what we want. We don't want an invasion and lots of hundreds and thousands of people being killed, but the fact that there was a change in the nature of the state is something which encourages us to think that this is possible here as well. And that's very significant. There are lots of other things I could mention, like attempts at changing facts on the ground through naturalization of non-Bahrainis who happen to be Sunni in particular, or even elements of what's sometimes called the new Sunni awakening. For example, the new party, the Tajammu al-Ittihad al-Watani, which started as a loyalist movement back in in March last year, is still seen primarily as a growth movement. One of the funny things actually about those chaps is that when they first started operating in the offices in Manama, they didn't have their own stationery and they were using Saudi embassy stationery, which kind of says it all. But since then, I think some interesting things happened. They didn't run in the by-elections in September, and in some discussions with elements of the opposition, they've actually even suggested that they could think about changes in government. Not getting rid of the ruling family, but certainly of, for example, displacing the Prime Minister, which is a major issue. So various things on the ground have changed, and I'll back up. I just want to finally mention two things about, again, coming back to this issue of why should we be interested in Bahrain? And what sort of game changes can we see? The first obvious reason why we should be interested in Bahrain, and the reason why, for example, government departments and oil companies want to speak to me, is energy security. There is money to be made on Bahrain. The second reason, of course, for those of us who are interested in things like ethnic politics and ethnopolitics is to what extent is the conflict really an ethnic conflict or communal conflict? And how can Bahrain perhaps allow us to think creatively about issues around that? Related to that is about wider issues around political reform in the Gulf. Again, for people studying political reform and democratization in the Middle East, looking at the Gulf is not popular because, frankly, there is none in any serious manner. But the possibilities of what can happen and the fact that a number of Gulf countries that are mentioned, including Bahrain, have strong democratic movements and strong movements in favor of political reform. And these things are not just top-down, is important. The reason why I mention the top-down is that one of the most famous articles on reform, which goes back 4 or 5 years, Ehtishami and Wright argue that political reform in the Gulf is really a top-down affair. And this is actually just not true. It's empirically quite easy to demonstrate that it's not necessarily true. And of course there's the issue of human rights abuses, which should concern us. When weapons are used to kill and repress people which happen to have been made in Britain or made in the US, that should be a matter of concern for us. It's not something that we can easily brush aside and not... it should be a case that while one doesn't assume that there will be an ethical foreign policy going back to the 90s being pursued in Britain, we shouldn't be completely compartmentalized, in the sense that we separate business from human rights. So what are the potential game changers? I'll mention just two game changers. One is the fact that any move forward will have to basically include all parties on the ground. The old Bahraini opposition cannot just negotiate with the ruling family on its own. They have to include, of course, the old Sunni Bahraini communities in places like Muharraq, and they have to take into consideration groups like the Tajammu. And secondly, that they need to see what's possible. The Kuwaiti model, I'm not convinced will be sufficient in the short term, or even in the long term. And one wonders whether any move towards an actual republic is really going to be possible in somewhere like Bahrain. But on the street, basically that's what increasingly I think people want. They don't want a monarchy at all. And that actually then makes any serious negotiations really problematic. And I'll stop there.